Tonight, Georgia isn't just deciding a handful of races, it's revealing where its policies are headed next. These special runoff elections go far beyond filling seats or replacing Marjorie Taylor Greene in the 14th district. They test whether Democratic overperformance in the Trump second term era can turn into lasting gains, whether Republican loyalty to Donald Trump still dominates deep red territory, and whether America's most closely watched battleground is entering a new, more volatile phase. Runoffs strip everything down to one question: who can close? Last month's crowded fields are gone. What's left are sharper, cleaner matchups and clearer answers. In the 14th congressional district, Democrat Sean Harris casted himself as a grounded dirt road Democrat, while Republican Clay Fuller ran fully aligned with Trump's America First message. That contrast isn't just political theater, it's a real time test of whether competence, independence, and local focus can break through in culturally conservative terrain. Zoom out, and a bigger pattern emerges. Since Trump's return to office, Democrats have consistently outperformed expectations. They haven't flipped everything, but down ballot, where turnout and organization rule, they've been punching above their weight. So tonight has not just been about winning expected races like House Districts 94 and the 130. It's about whether Republicans are forced to defend ground that should be safe for them. And all of this unfolds under the shadow of something bigger. Georgia remains ground zero for the ongoing fight over democracy. The 2020 election aftermath, the Raffensperger call, the false electors, the push to overturn election results still defines the state's political identity. Here, that conflict isn't abstract, it's local, it's personal, it's unfinished. At the same time, redistricting battles continue to shape the terrain. These aren't just lines on a map, they're fights over representation, race, and power. As Georgia grows more diverse, the tension between that reality and the political structure meant to contain it becomes impossible to ignore. Turnout, momentum, even outcomes, they all run through the maps. And looming ahead is the Save America Act, a proposal with major implications. Supporters call it election integrity. Critics see new barriers to voting. In a state decided by razor-thin margins, changes to registration and access are not minor. They directly shape who participates and who gets left out. And that's why this moment matters. This isn't just a set of special elections, it's a snapshot of a state in transition. Trumpism remains powerful, but not unchallenged. Democratic energy is real, but still evolving. And everything from turnout to district lines to voter access feeds into the same question. Not just who won tonight, but who Georgia is becoming. I'm so glad to be joined by Representative El-Mahdi Holly, who represents Georgia's 116th district. At a night like this, Representative Holly, I'm glad to have someone as knowledgeable on Georgia politics as you. I want to start off the conversation about the recent headline that's literally still fresh. Tonight's biggest headline is that Republican Clay Fuller has now been projected the winner in the race for Georgia's 14th congressional district. He will be taking Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat, which means Democrats once again showed energy, but did not convert that into a congressional flip in one of the marquee races of the evening. What do you think the real lesson of tonight is?
Well, I think that it's at first I have to say thank you for having me on the show, and really thank you for that truncated manner in which to look at these national and local issues and to be able to put it so succinctly. With respect to Clay Fuller and Sean Harris, that was never expected to be a Democratic win. I look at the race with Deborah Shigley. Again, it was never expected that a Democrat was going to become a winner. And so I think what you're seeing is that in a time where populations are shifting, at a time when you're having so many who are spread across our metro area, that it's not typically, we would look at it as, for those who are living within Atlanta area, that they're, completely inside of the perimeter of I-285, that the freeway that cuts in through every county. And what you're saying is that even though the district lines have changed, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, it's still pretty red. It's always kind of been red. And so what I think that candidates are doing by running in these districts are they're really trying to build out the base, But what we know about Georgia voters, probably like voters in any other area, is that typically they don't pick up the desire to get interested in the politics until it's election season. And so what I look at tonight with Sean's loss, it's a Democratic gain and getting people aware about the issues as it relates to their bank accounts, as it relates to this nation, and then having people figure out how to organize in order to see that the candidate of their choice is on the ballot. So this is an experiment for a launch of a campaign to come in very small and much smaller races. And I think that sometimes you got to go and hit big. Brigadier General Sean Harris focused on this race to get his name out there. Remember Marcus Flowers, who was his predecessor in this race. This was just an attempt to show people that Democrats who are living there that if you get out and if you organize, that you can at least be strong enough to be able to carry a race in the future. Perhaps not Marjorie Taylor Greene's former seat. Again, if you have, I think it was just only Sean Harris is the only Democrat out of a litany of other Republicans. That tells you right there that if those Republicans consolidate their votes, it's probably not going to be a Democratic seat, right? And so this is merely about getting people in the area to focus that they don't have to stay at home. They don't have to simply just stay quiet and silent while you have a Republican running for a former Republican seat, that you can get out and have those discussions. And what I hope, the big takeaway is that for voters who are out there, at least to be able to discuss the difference of point of views between that of Clay Fuller's and that of Sean Harris, they're able to see where there are similarities. Good to be able to see where there's divisions, but see where the similarities are, because I think when you know that, then you'll be able to run a better candidate who more likely will be able to give Clay Fuller a more of a challenge in trying to remove him from the seat in the future.
Now, Representative Holly, Democrats have continued to overperform in many special elections. They have, since Donald Trump returned to office, been able to flip 30 congressional seats in the House of Representatives. Republicans have flipped none. Even though they've kept the 14th congressional district tonight, they have not flipped any seats since 2025. And when you look at even the state level, and you look at how the wind continues to be in the Democratic Party's sails, you've got, for instance, you've got commissioner races in the state of Georgia that have flipped for the Democratic Party. You have states that are very hardcore, very Republican states, also flipping in terms of state delegate seats, state representative seats for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
These are very these are not seats that were guaranteed or expected to go Democratic in any way, shape, or form. Now, when you consider that, but you also consider tonight's disappointing turnout for the Democratic Party as it pertains to the 14th congressional district, it raises a nagging question again. Is Democratic enthusiasm translating into durable power, or mostly respectable losses in difficult terrain? And how do you read that tension tonight?
Yeah, so great question. I think that first I must say that I think for the turnout, it's the turnout among Democratic people for the most part, those who consider themselves Democratic voters, or even those opportunity voters that believe in a lot of the platform issues that Democrats often champion. They are the working class people who are, for the most part, busy working. They don't. Many of them actually don't have a lot of the liberty to actually be able to go and take advantage of the vote. They're not. The Democrats tend to not champion the side of the wealthy 1%. We're kind of the big tent party for the 99% who are busy working. And I think that oftentimes people respond the most when they have the most to fear. And unfortunately, right now, I don't think that most people whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or none of them. So I really don't think that people are on the fear side. I know we see the No Kings rallies, and No Kings, while I think it's building the momentum, I think that voters are not yet really feeling the pain to which they'll get out. This is not a 2020 moment. Right now, it does not feel like 2020. I think give it a year, give it a year, give these gas prices to go through the roof, wars that we didn't ask to be in, money going overseas to, fund bombing campaigns that nobody agreed to. I think after a while, people are going to see that, and particularly among Democratic voters, going to say, wait a second, we got to step up and we got to return with some level of fight. We're not really seeing that right now. And I think that one of the unfortunate sides of having a Trump presidency the first time is that people have grown accustomed to the chaos. They've grown accustomed to seeing these complete disregards for the War Powers Resolution, complete disregard for Congress, and allowing for the executive order to literally trump the will of the American people. And people have gotten really comfortable with it. Do you see the systems of democracy and the transparency that we often relied upon, the accountability? Do you see it being eroded? Yes. Are people okay with it? They are. And I think that says a lot about our nation and its 250th year as to what freedoms people will allow to be compromised in order for the sake of their comfort. I think oftentimes, especially I say it within my party, but I know that it's true across the board and certainly across the aisle, is that people don't take action until they get uncomfortable, which means that the reason that you don't see much change there is people are very comfortable with their lives. It's tough, it's chaotic, but what happens when you see a failure in leadership? Oftentimes it will condition you to expect nothing more than that. And when you set your sight at something low and it becomes to speak to you and says, you know what, you can't go any higher, so get accustomed to where you are. And I think that's where a lot of Americans are. So I think with respect to Democrats taking seats and flipping these seats, I think that comes by actually being with people. The connection has to be more than just a political election. When you're focused on just an election, again, you're chasing the wind, because election seasons happen and then they go. But a part of the narrative where you're seeing that more working class people are getting progressive representation, it's because it's not just Democrats. You're having people who are connected and are willing to actually make the priorities of regular working class people become manifest to the point that now you're demanding to see representation that highlights the struggles that people are going through right now, and very real struggles. So I'm glad that we're seeing that for those 30 seats or more, that those on the left are able to harness that momentum and be able to translate it in a way that actually speaks to voters. But in truth, I don't think that type of fervor that we saw in 2020 has really hit people yet. I do believe that there's going to be a lot more violations of our Constitution that are going to be a lot more direct. And then from there, I do believe there'll be enough impetus for the people to demand the change that they really want to see.
And just to clarify about the races I was alluding to earlier, you have the Public Service Commission District 2 race, where Alicia Johnson defeated incumbent Tim Echols, the Republican, with 63% of the vote, flipping the seat and becoming the first Black woman elected statewide in Georgia. Then you had the Public Service Commission District 3, where Peter Hubbard, the Democrat, defeated incumbent Fitz Johnson with 59 to 63% of the vote, flipping the seat in the Metro Atlanta area. Then you had State House District, the State House District seat. That election was on December 9th of 2025. Eric Gisler, the Democrat, flipped the seat from Republican Marcus Widower's vacancy in a Northeast Georgia district. You have the win in the Democratic Party sales, it seems. And then going back even to Pennsylvania County, outside the state of Georgia, Democrats swept Bucks County's row offices on November 4th last year, flipping key seats for the first time in modern history. You had the district attorney race, where Joe Kahn defeated the incumbent Jennifer Scorn. The sheriff's race, Danny Kisler ousted incumbent Fred Herron. And then you had other flips. You had New Jersey, of course, legislative flips in New Jersey, in addition to the governorship being maintained in the Democratic Party column. Virginia legislative flips, Iowa legislative flips, and then Mississippi legislative flips. Legislative flips, where you have 2 Senate districts, Johnny Dupree and Teresa Gillespie Islam, winning their respective races, and House District 22, where Justin Crosby, the Democrat, won over John Lancaster. I mean, these are particular. I mean, a lot of these races are areas where folks would think that the Democratic Party would have to invest a whole lot of money if they had any shot at flipping those particular seats. And for those who may be thinking, well, why am I going into these local races? Well, we saw the incredible significance of these local races when we saw the effort in 2020 for state legislatures to try to send an alternate state of electors. When there was a call to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who's currently running for the governorship, to find 11,780 votes for Donald Trump. And so these races set the stage for who's going to be in place on election night 2028, when, let's face it, based on what you just said about enthusiasm, it could be another close election. We would love to see an election with decisive numbers, where it's called early, pretty much like how it was in 2012, where you didn't have to really, stay up that late to see President Barack Obama get reelected. But, based on what you're saying and based on voter apathy, it looks as if there very well might be a more successful attempt by the Trump administration to try to manipulate and alter the outcome of an election in his favor and his party's favor. We're already seeing intervention from the federal level into Fulton County. If you could shed some light on that and your perspective on that as a state representative, sir.
Oh, yes, certainly. I remember even when President Trump was reelected, and I remember his top advisor, Stephen Miller, being asked on TV as to the extent to which President Trump will use his executive orders to circumvent Congress and to be able to establish his authority. And at the time, Stephen Miller had a wire in his ear, and he said that the president had plenary power. And then the mic cut, like literally, he said nothing. The interviewer asked him questions, and I think probably a lot of people saw that someone on the other end of his earpiece was telling him, "Shut up, say nothing less, say nothing more about this. Be quiet." So even by his own words. So again, let's not even get into why he stopped speaking. Let's get into what he said. The president having plenary power, that is an enormous amount of power, completely unchecked. And if he believes that he actually has the power to go around Congress, to not respect the checks and balances that are constitutional, that are very instrumental to the functioning of our country, well, then we have a president who is absolutely rogue. When you see those No Kings rally, that's what they mean. That if you have a leader who is absolutely unchecked, then that means if he believes he has plenary power, then, what can you do to stop him? And I mean, here's a guy who, we've already seen these, if you choose to believe him, of the assassination attempts. You see someone who is willing to still be unchecked and allow for the public media on Truth Social or, whatever chaotic platform that he's paying attention to be able to control him. Then you have someone who the Supreme Court has not yet placed enough in the way of checking his behavior. Now, they have been able to stop some of his actions, some of these executive orders that sought to enforce an immigration policies, certainly like those on the Haitians and other people who were in this country on temporary protective status while they had their cases being heard. But I think what you're seeing is a president who is using his powers going around Congress and to be able to exact his authority, even though that authority, the legal justifications for that authority are completely in a volatile and oftentimes unjustifiable manner. And so I think that one of the things we saw with the federal troops going into Fulton County to seize these ballot boxes, and then to find out there's nothing. It's been a whole lot of hype, but it's went dead quiet. Couldn't find any instances of fraud. I think really, while we're focusing on Fulton County, what we should be looking at is that it's literally it's the thought that's in the back of our minds, but we have to bring it forth, which is we know that the president, come election season, is going to be sending in his thugs, sending in these federal troops into local counties, primarily targeting Democratic cities. And again, it's not because of any sign of corruption, because of course there was nothing that came, no charges that came after he went and took these files. But this is an effort to undermine the constitutional democracy that our republic that has in place. And if he can do that, then also how are these troops going to be used to undermine voters' attempts to actually go and cast a ballot? This is an exercise in a lot of the attempts that we saw in the late 1960s and 50s and before then in the South, when you did not have the protections that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were able to install. And unfortunately, until we as voters, we as Americans will realize that these constant attempts and very successful attempts to undermine democracy, to get beyond the checking power of Senate as well as the Congress, until we see this as being a very serious threat to all of our shared interests in a democracy, we may be caught sleeping in our pants down in a way that is going to allow for a convicted felon to take advantage of Americans the way that he's very practiced in doing so.
Representative Holly, the criminal, like you alluded to just now, the criminal election interference case that once centered on Fulton County was ultimately dismissed in late 2025 last year. But the underlying political conflict over 2020 did not disappear with the case. Has Georgia effectively become the symbolic capital of election denialism in the Trump era?
I can't say that Georgia has been. I think I think you've seen that in a lot of other places, particularly, I know you will get into the topic of redistricting. Where you're seeing that effort not only just in Georgia, you're seeing it in Texas, you're seeing all over the country, where you have a lot of folks who are so dead set focused on worshiping this president. They are refusing to look at even the Heritage Foundation's files before 2020 that saw that, out of 20 years, that you only had, I think, less than 17 cases of election fraud. But however, as soon as Trump got in office, the same organization completely switched up. And I think when people are able to be honest with themselves and do the research prior to his administration, you're able to see that we've actually had some very fair elections. And I think that because we're dealing with a man who was a master at the fire sales, everything must go, the world's about to end. He's great at it. We look at a man who is, we're all seeing it, very guilty of palling around with a convicted pedophile, with his friends, being able to have these very young, underaged girls all through Mar-a-Lago. We know that he has a penchant for grabbing girls. We won't no need to say it. We all know it. And so, I don't even hear as much talk about QAnon. It's like the QAnon completely disappeared. This whole idea about that there's a pedophile ring in the higher levels of power. Well, here you go. Everybody sees it. You see President Trump before he became president, hanging out with Ghislaine Maxwell. You see this guy, and you see the influence of him preying on young women, whether they were women at all, who knows? But we all know. And what we're seeing is that this man will go to no end to distract us from the fact that we have a convicted felon who has had a very unhealthy taste for our young people. And because we're not putting too much of the focus on that, we're allowing ourselves to chase after these extremities and changing our democracy, going to seize ballots, federal seizure of state ballots. And we're just seeing this. We know that a lot of this is a distraction, just like the Iranian war. All of it because you don't want us to actually see these heavily redacted Jeffrey Epstein files that show Donald Trump's name in those files throughout. Because there's such a desire to keep it quiet, we're going through all these different attempts to undermine our democracy. And I think it's time, Americans, when we realize how much we're being played by somebody who has, again, a very demonic and unhealthy taste for young girls and these very lewd interactions with people who are themselves convicted of messing around with children. If we take our eye off the ball, then we're allowing somebody who does not respect our democracy to pull the wool over our eyes. And I think that's where it not only hurts Democrats, it hurts America.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And you alluded to the redistricting efforts of Georgia. Georgia's redistricting wars have already reshaped representation after a federal judge found earlier maps illegally diluted Black voting power, even though revised maps still preserve much of the Republican advantage in the state of Georgia. In plain political terms, how have those maps, the map battles, changed the playing field for Democrats and for Black voters across the state of Georgia?
Absolutely. I believe that when you look at the undermining of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, with the Section 5, having the mandating for pre-clearance, what it recognizes is that in the South, where historically, certainly during the 1960s, and you have the opportunity for people to be able to vote, particularly those who've been marginalized, that they needed to have a judge to look over those maps. And, with that being overridden through the case of Shelby v. Holder, and even now with the challenges of Section 2, you're seeing these opportunities that were granted to those in the minority to be able to be seen and taken seriously, to not have, to not even have the undergo the misfortune of taking poll tests, these literacy tests or paying poll taxes, things that were set up to undermine people's ability to be able to cast a ballot. And then what you're seeing with redistricting is that the responsibilities that the voters will place upon the representatives in their district, well, when those representatives are no longer there because they've been drawn out and cut out, well, now where are those priorities on whose backs are they placed? How do those local voters are able to see that their wishes for a public service that respects their wishes, how do they see that it's actually going to be carried by a person within whom they never voted? And I think that's what it is. It's unfortunate. I know for me, here it is. I remember when, prior to my winning in 2018, my district was drawn to unfairly take minority voters, many of them African Americans, and cut them out of the district by actually, one of my current senators. And I remember that after I won, and I ran against his replacement, a Republican incumbent, and doing the work on the ground. I think the Republican incumbent had around 12,000. I had 12,000. He had 12,000 Republicans. I had about 12,000 Democrats, but I also picked up roughly about 3,854 swing voters and lean Republicans. And we flipped that seat. I remember that the Republican Party tried to find a fake Democrat. They put a fake Democrat in the race. And you go to her profile and she's hugged up with all the Republicans. There's not a single Democrat around her. And in the South we have open primaries. And then afterwards, when they can't beat you, what do? They cut up my district. They cut it up one time, and the time that you're referring to, we actually had our local representative, Sherman Lofton, who is a strong, active citizen, a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, who filed a lawsuit to say that his voting power and that of his neighbors was being diluted. And I remember in the 2023 session, before we went to Thanksgiving, Steve Jones, federal circuit court judge, brought us all back in and said, you have to give us new maps. New maps were drawn within only 3 hours. 3 hours, new maps were drawn. And it wasn't drawn fairly, but what happened is that those districts that were found to be in violation were drawn in to districts that were in compliance. And so literally, I think, I'd like to commend Judge Steve Jones. I think he tried to do the best that he could. But when he reviewed the new maps, what he said is that there's a high likelihood that these new maps actually broke up coalition districts, where it wasn't based off of race. It wasn't or based off of one particular race, but you could have multiple parties, multiple people, multiple people who have a shared interest, and that these actually broke them up, which is why he dismissed he allowed for the maps that were drawn in 2023. He allowed for them to stay, but he said, you know what, I will not dismiss this with prejudice in case you want to come back and file to make that case that this broke up these coalition districts. And so we're seeing this desire to manipulate power, to be able to have one person be able to command a much larger territory, and what it does when you dilute that power, when you have it where Republicans will tell you, oh, well, you get to elect somebody who's more like you. But the question always becomes, who's deciding who's more like me? And I think that's the unfortunate side. When you have these very adverse redistricting desires to cut up these maps, it's the voters who are completely taken as fools. And I think, it's all of these are attempts to undermine democracy rather than doing what I believe is right, which is to have either you're going to have an independent redistricting committee. That was one of my first bills when I got elected in 2018. But if you can't have that, then what you need to do is run a great candidate. If you need to have a candidate who's able to speak to the values of people who are outside of his party, you can do that. Because, Michael, just as you know, in our state legislature, 80 to 85% of the legislation that is passed is agreed on in a bipartisan manner, which means that there's an 80 to 85% chance that if you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you actually might be able to speak to some concerns that are reflected in communities outside of your own. And I think that if we just keep that in mind, we can see that there is hope for the Democratic Party in being able to speak to the issues as they relate to people on the ground outside of elections. By the time the election gets here, it's really too late. You need to be talking to people right now, and you need to be talking to them well after these elections happen, and help them to see that your party is going to champion their desires to lower taxes, be able to put taxes in programs that actually do help people, like making sure we have an expanded Medicaid, be able to make sure that people can afford to see their doctor. And here's what I'm hoping Democrats will also do, and I'll just say this. I hope that we can speak to people in layman's terms. Stop being so collegiate, come down to people's levels and be able to speak it. Most people speak at a 7th to 8th grade level of language, not because they're stupid. It's just, some of the big words, complicate things. Speak to people in an uncomplicated way about the things they care about. And I think that's what's going to help us to actually flip these seats and to keep a majority when we finally get one.
Representative Holly, you alluded to turnout a little bit in your response to the last question, but I have noticed there's been an ongoing debate within the Democratic Party since the aftermath of 2024. A lot of conclusions have been made, and a lot of them, I believe, are the wrong conclusions. A lot of folks focus on wanting to make sure that the candidate is perfect. Others think that, that this is an issue about identity, Democrats making too much of an issue of identity politics. But when you look at the black voter turnout in the 2024 presidential election, it was about 60%, which was down from 2020, leaving roughly 14 million eligible Black Americans who did not vote. Official data from sources like U.S. Census and USA Facts confirm this information, with Black eligible voters totaling around 34.4 million. In my view, the Democratic Party left a lot of votes on the table by not going into predominantly African American areas, like certain areas in the South, like southeastern North Carolina, certain parts in Atlanta, in the suburban metro Atlanta area. You have folks in the Philadelphia area. You have folks in Detroit. There were a lot of folks that were not paying attention and honing in on the folks that brought them to the dance. Black voters are the reason why we got 2020 for Joe Biden, 2008 for Barack Obama, 2012 for Barack Obama, 1996 for Bill Clinton, 1992 for Bill Clinton, and folks, especially the elitists, those who are in the punditry class, seem to be drawing all kinds of conclusions about making sure that the candidate sounds like the perfect Republican light candidate. And then you've got folks who are upset because they felt, for instance, in the state of Texas, that they had an opportunity with Jasmine Crockett to turn out Black votes. But then you have folks that say, well, Jasmine Crockett didn't run a good campaign because she wasn't hitting the airwaves aggressively. She wasn't campaigning in areas that could actually turn the tide for her. And James Tallarico spoke the language of the so-called moderate Republican voter, the evangelical person who reluctantly voted for Trump a third time. What do you say about this debate? Is this a matter of finding the perfect candidate or generating turnout among the base you already have? Because when you look at the other side, even the State of the Union, Democrats always do this dance after they get elected of trying to signal to the American people that even if you didn't vote for me, I'm going to represent you. Donald Trump has done nothing to signal to anyone who has not voted for him in 2016, 2020, or in 2024 that he's going to do his best to represent them and to win their support. In fact, he's doubled down on the white grievance politics. He's doubled down on the scare tactics. He's doubled down on on making immigrants the enemy. And Democrats now seem to be the timid party, trying to figure out which lane they fit in and which approach is best.
Yeah, I remember someone asked me about, oh my gosh, what do you think when Kamala lost? And and I told him, I came up with a little adage. I said, was it when you get in office, you start reaching towards the middle. As you come in office, start reaching towards your middle. You realize you're no longer standing on your base, and you come up with little. And that's just kind of what it's been. I think that Democrats, we actually can stand strong on our platform. And we have a platform that doesn't reach across the aisle. No, it does. It's very clear. We're looking out for the 99%. And I think what we've seen is that when Democrats are too scared to stand on the platform that they say their party is based on, we say our party is based on, and we start getting lied. I've seen it among some of my own colleagues. Some of them are no longer in the House with me, but I remember when I looked at one of them, and he's a minister, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm kind of left of center." I said, "Left of center? That's not us." Being a leftist, being in favor of working people, being in favor of poor people, I see that as, at least within my own faith journey, I see that as very much Christ-like. It's very Jesus Christ-like in my eyes that you're going to look out for those who are the have-nots, who are the least, who are the forgotten, that you speak to their needs, and actually to be able to find ways to help them that don't always fall within the basket of what I can do for you once I'm elected. No, help people right now. Find a way to help people. That's why, at least for me, I knew early on that getting into the political realm was just an extension of the heavy volunteerism that I did, and I mean, whether it's volunteerism in high school, racking up 540 hours a year for all 4 years I was at Morehouse College, and volunteering when you're with people while they're hurting, while they're suffering, and you find ways to be able to assist them. You're not reaching across the aisle away from your values. What you're really doing is you're standing firmly on the values of representing the working class that Democrats have always have known to be our values. That's what makes our tent so big, because it's the only way you can fit in 99% of Americans. And I think that what happens is that when people going in, or you get some Democrats to go in there and do a 25-hour filibuster, another one to get in there and do a rap for every consonant, and then you're looking and say, wait a second, but you guys are actually, you're not standing so firm. The truth is while you're seeing it, the squad, right? You see, Congresswoman Presley, you see, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, or Congresswoman Bush, and people looking like, oh, they must be socialists. Nah, check this. They're Democrats. They're the ones who actually decided to stand on our platform of our issues that we said we agree on. And so that's the unfortunate side. So I see with former Vice President Harris's race for president, again, one that she didn't seek to take over once Biden was in. She herself didn't run and say, hey, hey, Mr. President, you did a great job. Let me get this from here. She didn't do that. And so I think, what you saw out of that race, people want to know that they have a choice in the democracy, that the person that they vote for, they can stay with, and that they'll do the job. And the bait and switch doesn't work. I think that, whether it's a bait and switch, they tried that on the Republican side, it's not going to work. People are like, wait, hey, what's this? This is not, we're not ready for this. I didn't have enough. You got to give voters enough time to actually condition themselves to actually be there for that candidate. But even further, I think what Democrats didn't do, at least nationally in 2024, is they didn't realize that the people who were protesting actually vote. And if what's their protest? Their protest is that you're shipping too much of American dollars. Again, this came right after a deadly pandemic, one that wiped out so many communities. People left this earth; they'll never be back because of this virus. And then all the money that could have been kept to be able to help people, they saw it going overseas. They saw it going to blow up civilians, and far overseas. Why should American dollars go to Gaza? Why can't they stay here and help out the families the way that Congress approved the stimulus checks during a time when people were being laid off of work and couldn't go into work? And so I think what we see among certainly among African Americans, we want to know, do you have my back? Do you have my back to give me the funds that be able to help me to be able to get up off my ground? It's not that people are relying on that money, but they want to know, can you support me if I, as a dutiful taxpayer, am paying into the system? And to send the money overseas, and then people complain, say, hey, what about me? And they're protesting. They're using the same God-given liberties that are not only inherent in the First Amendment of our Constitution, but are certainly speaking to the traditions of protest that men like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend James Orange have done, Fannie Lou Hamer. This falls within the tradition for how many of those who fly the Democratic banner have come to believe is how you get your rights. It's a belief in how you organize at the grassroots level to get what you want. And so when we saw, I believe, whether it's President Joe Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris say, hey, let me not take these controversial stances and let me just kind of scoot on by. I know I'm getting money from the people who from foreign nationals who are now directing Donald Trump's every move through Benjamin Netanyahu. I know this is wrong, but I'm going to stay quiet as Americans in the world watch our tax dollars go to blow up civilians, blow up entire hospitals. That's immorally wrong. That's, that I think for our people, we said it's all, this is against what I believe in terms of what, again, certainly in the South, African Americans largely, being, if not Christian, Muslim, say, hey, what are you doing? This is against what I believe. And I think that when, we see this, this willingness to step away from our democratic values and start reaching across the aisle, what happens is it waters down what we believe. It waters down these maxims that speak to how we are so much in favor of helping out the middle class. It actually shows that we are not as strong. And I don't think that that's true. I think that we're much stronger. But until we can believe it, until we can believe what that document, that Democratic Party document says what we believe in, until we actually adhere to what's written that we all agreed upon, then unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of weak candidates step up, will step away from being even seen as a Democrat, will constantly look at people who are just standing on the principle for what Democrats say in their platform. You're gonna look and you're gonna see weaker candidates not willing to stand up on the values that our document, our platform says that we actually stand for. And I think voters are looking right through it and they see who's bought. They see who's bought. They see who would be kept silent. And I think that's why, it's really to put it simply, Brother Michael, I think people are done with seeing the Cuomo Democrat. And I think you're going to start seeing more of the Mamdani Democrat, and that means that you got to show up for people. You got to stick to the values of uplifting the people at the bottom. And you got to have clear communication that doesn't see Democrats get elected and then run away from their base or act like their base is completely silent while they're on the streets protesting. That's wrong. We have to be responsible for the people that we that have voted us in.
Representative Mamdani, Representative Holly.
Sorry, I take that. That's a good compliment.
As you were speaking, I couldn't help but think this is the time Democrats need to draw the dots for people.
Yeah.
Because, for all the criticism the Biden-Harris administration got for, not being aggressive enough against Netanyahu's indiscriminate bombing campaign, Biden publicly condemned Israel's indiscriminate bombing in December 2023.
Yeah, but he condemned it and funded it at the same time. So,
No. I acknowledge that. But what I'm saying is, in a system where you have two choices, right? And one side, warns that it was eroding global support. One side in February 2024, the Biden administration called Israel's response over the top. And then in May 2024, he paused shipment of 3,500 plus 2,000 pound bombs over the Rafah invasion. Then you have the vice president, Harris, demanding an immediate ceasefire in March of 2024. And then she slammed aid blockages as unacceptable. And, Biden accused Netanyahu of prolonging the war for political survival. And in June 2024, Time interview. The U.S. built a temporary Gaza aid pier, airdrop supplies, and pressured Israel to allow more trucks. Actions amid 30,000 plus Palestinian deaths. And you look at that and you put that side by side by a campaign, the Donald Trump campaign, that could not care less about turning Gaza into a parking lot. And then you have protesters who repeatedly interrupt Biden-Harris rallies. When Harris became the nominee, they interrupt her rallies. They don't go to any of the Trump rallies. They make sure, even now, they interrupt her book tours, while Harris has literally no power over foreign policy. Donald Trump, who was the head of state, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, they don't get any visits from these folks.
I wouldn't say that, but I got you.
But Representative Holly, correct me if I'm wrong, but how have they been pushing back against this regime? I mean, look, if Gaza is the sole fact issue for you that determined whether you're going to even participate in this high stakes election, I would argue the stakes were not as high since 1864, when we literally could have had a Confederate States of America permanently. And you decide to take your foot off the gas once the Democratic Party is no longer in the White House, and you continue to interrupt the events of people who will literally have no power or say in how the Pentagon makes its decisions. That to me is a sign of being disingenuous, or at least politically immature, because it's not as if you're applying this pressure evenly across the board. And I want to get your position on this, because let's face it, in Michigan, in Dearborn, Michigan, you had people who actually said they're voting uncommitted. And by doing that, they committed themselves to ICE raids. They committed themselves to because let's face it, only one party wins when people do not vote, when people of color primarily don't vote, and that's the Republican Party. So the Trump campaign benefited immensely by that uncommitted voter in Dearborn, Michigan, because it allowed the process to the White House that much easier. There's a reason why Netanyahu's the first call Donald Trump got, the first congratulatory call from a foreign leader, was from Netanyahu. Donald Trump thanked Black America for not turning out at the rate they did in 2020 on election night. What do you say to those concerns that I have about young people who apply their pressure selectively?
Yeah, I think that you have to look at. I think that and it's just kind of, in my opinion on this, I think that people are a lot more tuned in to the authenticity of the person who will seek their vote. And I think that authenticity that people are demanding goes beyond just the election that's in front of them. I think that this is more, if you want to understand how that voter that, or voters that people are saying, hey, well, how come they didn't have Democrats? They're way better than Trump. In fact, I'm gonna give you an example. I remember in 2016, when I was regional field director for the state Democratic Party, and I was managing the voter output in Macon, Georgia. And I remember my supervisor, I won't mention his name, he instructed me to go out, as he did, other field directors, and commit to vote cards, make sure that people could sign up their name, their email address, their phone number, because they were going to pledge that they were going to vote. And I remember there was an area right off of Macedonia in Macon. Actually, it's over by Macedonia Baptist Church. It's on Eisenhower in Macon. And there's an area called Bird City. It's a housing project community where all the streets are named for birds. And so after I went canvassing it, my supervisor at the time said, hey, canvass that area right next to it. And I looked down that area, and I was like, it was a tough area for people to live in, because I told him, I said, man, I'm looking at a guy whose bathroom, kitchen, and bedroom are all in one place. He's got a pot up. And I'm telling you now, I could see a squirrel jumping down into that pot. Like he's homeless, but not just homeless, abject poverty. These people are living on scraps. I can't go down there. I can try to help him, but I can't get him to commit to vote and sign his name on a card. And my supervisor said, no, you got to. And I said, why? What's the incentive? He said, if you don't get him to sign up to commit to vote, Donald Trump's going to be the president. And I said, brother, this man don't have a rag to his name, and Obama's the president. He couldn't see that. The tough part is that we're busy trying to focus on, Democrats are often told, hey, focus on this one guy. If he just get this race, if he just gets this win, then old democracy is just going to be completely safeguarded. And we didn't see that in Biden. It took a long time and a lot of cumulative effort to get Trump out of office. Biden gets in it, and then it's symbolic. You know, Black folks get a Juneteenth holiday. Again, I think folks were asking for reparations. Did it come anywhere close to that? No. Study committee towards that? No. You get a federal holiday and a formal apology. Again, we're not upset. We're just saying particularly like jumping for joy happy, right? And, 400 years and you get a federal holiday. You come after a pandemic. Folks are appreciative of a stimulus check through Congress, but what are you seeing? You're seeing these institutional investors who are buying up blocks of houses. Did people be able to get some assistance with that to be able to keep their houses? No. What happens when Vice President Kamala Harris runs for office? She has this point. She says, "Oh, I'm going to 30,000 houses are going to be built." Well, wait a second. When your man was the president and you were the VP, we didn't see none of that. None of that was talking. Didn't see none of it. But it really sounds good on a campaign trail. And I think what you're seeing is that when you get that resistance, you should listen to the voters. Don't scold the voters. Listen to why they're actually not in favor of putting in people who talk one thing and do something else. Folks who don't let the right hand see what the left hand is doing. Especially as Democrats, when we're looking, we want to know, do you have a back? If you're going to send billions overseas to somebody that you are saying is wrong, and I think that's what people saw. People saw a hypocrite in Biden. President Biden in 2021 literally said he's going to pull his support from Israel, and that's when Netanyahu actually stopped. That didn't happen in 2023, 24. What you had is Biden sending the money over there and saying, please look out. Please don't try not to hit civilians. Okay. Sent the money through. And again, this is American money. This is money that could have gone towards local hospitals. It could go to paying down the debt for medical bills that were incurred by working class people. This could have gone towards block grants for home development. Communities that have been ravaged, that money could have gone there. But he didn't send the money to our folks. He sent the money overseas. And so it's one thing if I'm going to chastise you, but I'm going to pay you. People can see right through that. They're not stupid. You can't I can't. And to your point, I'd say this. People want authenticity. And so you're saying, okay, well, what about the lesser of the two evils? What about going in and saying, hey, well, if I don't put the support behind Biden, then I get Trump. And what I think, Michael's happening is that people are saying, you know what, that's not enough. And I think we have to realize that while some people, politics is their religion, but to some people, religion is their politics. You've certainly seen that with Turning Point, right? Turning Point USA and, Charlie Kirk, and all of his followers. I think, so what happens is that I think people are failing to see that Americans come in all shades, and it's not just Christians who are evangelical who are in support of Republicans. You very much have Christians who are very much in support of democratic values. And when we look to our leaders and we're saying, wait a second, you claim to love Jesus, but I don't see Jesus in your actions, then it doesn't mean that I'm going against a Democrat to vote for a Republican. It's just that you didn't motivate me to come out. And so yeah, good.
I'm listening to you, but to me, and I want to get your take on this. The Biden administration was the most pro-black administration since Lyndon B. Johnson, and I'll tell you why.
All right, I'm listening. This is gonna be good.
You mentioned the American Rescue Plan, right? That American Rescue Plan delivered 1,400 stimulus checks, boosted child tax credit, reducing Black child poverty by 50%, from 26% to 13%, and then $4 billion debt relief for socially disadvantaged farmers, including Black-owned operations. That's just the American Rescue Plan.
Right.
You have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $1.2 trillion. $1.2 trillion package created 800,000 jobs, over 800,000 jobs, with 40% federal contracts targeted for minority-owned businesses, closing the Black unemployment gap. You had record-level unemployment among the African-American community. Then you had Executive Order 13985, which launched a whole of government racial equity agenda, requiring agencies to assess disparities, follow up executive orders in executive order in 2023 to that cut home appraisal gaps in Black neighborhoods by 40%. When Congress, remember the Senate that Biden had was literally by a one vote majority margin. That's the vote of Vice President Harris. It was a 50-50 split Senate. When the Senate did not act on the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, President Biden signed the George Floyd Justice Policing Executive Order. He expanded federal voting access with Executive Order 14019, combated suppression, and led to 20% plus increase in voter registration drives in Black communities. And then you have the CHIPS and Science Act, which had $52 billion invested in semiconductors, prioritizing HBCUs and minority STEM. It doubled Black venture capital funding to $1.4 billion. In terms of pardons and clemency, he issued over 4,000 pardons and commutations by 2024, including federal marijuana offenses, which were disproportionately African American offenses, disproportionately impacted African Americans. He reversed the 1994 crime bill's impacts in doing so.
I don't know about that one. You gotta leave that one alone. You can't reverse 30 years of.
But look, when you look at what the other side is, and I know you touched on how folks don't like that argument, but that's the reality. We have two. Cornel West is not going to be in the White House.
Yeah, I disagree with that view on reality.
So, but the bottom line is, in addition to all of this, you also have the first of its kind, the Justice 40 Initiative, which was an executive office aimed at rooting out environmental racism, predominantly Black neighborhoods, disproportionately affected by asthma and other respiratory diseases because there were specific landfills and other facilities that released toxic pollutants in their neighborhoods. No other administration had done anything like that. And then in terms of COVID equity initiative, Biden prioritized Black communities for 25 million vaccinations, cutting mortality disparities, student debt relief, which forgave $150 billion and 40% to Black homeowners. So when I look at the record in its totality, I can argue that Biden should have done more, that if we had the numbers in the Senate or the House, we could have gone even further. But to say that Biden was a hypocrite, or that he did nothing, or that he betrayed the trust.
No. You said that. I didn't say he did nothing.
Okay,
which is why that litany, I appreciate it. That's not my point. To say he's a hypocrite on foreign matters, that's there. I mean, it's just.
But in all fairness, every U.S. president, whether Democrat or Republican, has to support Israel. It's literally
no, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
3.8 billion goes to Israel yearly just
It
because.
does. It does. But what the thing is that you have to remember is that how you characterize that in your words, the right hand has to know what the left hand is doing. You can't say that, you know what, that I want a ceasefire, and then you give them the armaments to which they're not, and they're not just going after sending a SWAT team out there. You can't blow up. I mean, I don't know if we're on the same. Hopefully we're on the same page here. This wasn't like how the American military goes in and captures a group of people. We don't blow up entire hospitals. If we did that in the United States, heads would roll. You can't blow up an entire hospital. You can't blow up NICUs and say, well, they're hiding people in the basement. You know what happens when our SWAT does? What do they do, Mike? Don't they send people down into the basement to go? You send a team there. You don't blow up you don't blow up blocks and blocks of where people are living in there. That is a huge violation of the human rights. And here's the thing is, it's not to say that Biden wasn't good to black folks, right? I mean, we get the good massa scenario. Really, when he got in there, he did what we were expecting for him to do, which is why you can't put the blame on black people for why President Biden is not in office. I know folks want to do that, but that's African Americans we don't own the reason why President Biden wasn't elected or why Kamala Harris wasn't elected. Can't put that on us. But in terms of being able to see that this man and his administration handed out billions overseas and literally said, hey, try not to hit civilians, while entire blocks were being decimated. What happens is that it makes President Trump look like a villain, but so much damage was done that allows for President Trump to just come in and assume operations. President Trump looks like the villain, but here's the difference. AIPAC actually gave Biden $5 million to Trump's $924,000. Huge difference, and got a different amount of results, which is why this isn't about Black Americans turning on Biden. No, I think by large part, Black Americans actually did show up and actually did support the Kamala Harris attempt to take over for Biden. I think that the wider public, remember, we got 330 more million Americans. You got a good amount of folks who were protesting the streets, the same people protesting for Black Lives Matter when George Floyd was killed. Actually, it grew in numbers, not to just be African Americans in the streets. You got Jewish folks in the streets who say the state of Israel is not a monolith, that it's a political government that does not represent Jewish Americans, because Jewish Americans are what? Americans. You got folks who are Italians. You got folks, so many different people who are out in the streets and who are protesting. And what Democrats used to do is we used to appreciate protesters to say, let me understand what y'all are talking about. Let me come to your level and see why you're protesting. Let me actually count your voices with value, since you helped us all to get them in 2020. And so that's why I think what's happening is that because African Americans have always been the force of protest to get the larger issue, to make sure that the issue of the working class, that they directly affected us, being that we are the descendants of the human trafficking that established the economy for this nation. We're often the ones that people look to, but we are not. Our 13% in this country is not yet even 50%. And I think that what people should see is that, wow, yes, We are the base of the party. Do we come out to vote? Please. We've been doing it since after 1865. We show up. We show up even when lines are drawn and efforts are made to dilute our power. But what they have to realize is that we are just like so many others around this country. When we focus away from our ethnic background and we look at what things we actually care about, what folks need to see is that our wealth about who we are, it remains a positive that is as a force multiplier in terms of the unity that our country has. When they look at how you bring up people from the bottom, yeah, you look at us, but you look at how our strength resonates across the culture line, how our strength is strong across those working class people who work alongside us. And so if we see that working class people across the board, well, yes, we have African Americans amongst us, but we ain't the only ones here. We got Latino Americans who are here working alongside us, who go to the same places. We got poor working Caucasian Americans who are working alongside us. Now, granted, the banks may, because of the racism that is still alive in institutions, may grant them a easier time with getting access to capital, but many of them are still working alongside us, and which means when you look at those marches, it wasn't just black folks up in that march. There's a whole lot of people in that march. You had a whole lot of Christian Americans who are from Gaza. I know people assume that if you blow up all those people, they must be all Muslims. No, you think about the earliest Christian churches. They're right there in Bethlehem. Where do you think that is? They're there. And so what we're seeing is that when the president is telling us one thing, yeah, he's doing a lot for African Americans, but 13% of the population don't make 50% of the population. And so it means that people are wanting more of an authentic person in there who's not just doing stuff for one people. They want to see people do it for all of working class people that the Democratic Party is supposed to represent. So with that said, did it allow for President Trump to get in office? Yeah. But here's what I think people are expecting. I think that a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in the erosion of the victories won through the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, that took a cumulative effort. That wasn't just a 1 year. That wasn't just a one election. You think about all of the civil rights movements, the program of activities that were the investment of working class people like Charles Hamilton Houston. Look at James Baldwin. Look at Bayard Rustin. Look at A. Philip Randolph. And so when you look at the passing of the Voting Rights Act, granted, that may have been passed during the transition of President Kennedy to Lyndon Baines Johnson, but it was a cumulative effort that had been invested years and years and years before that. So I think that what we can do in honoring our ancestors is we may have to realize that in order to bring about the change that makes sure that good pieces of legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, good pieces of legislation like the Equal Rights Amendment, it's constant ratification. In order for us to change the system for the better, it may take us being invested far beyond simply one election cycle. We may take a cumulative effort over the years. And you know what? I think people are looking and saying, if we keep getting Democrats who can't stand on the principle of what their party platform actually says, hey, President Biden, you did a lot for African Americans. What about us over here that also part of this? What about if we can't make it so that what one group is getting, all of us are getting, then it may take for many cycles beyond just that next one in order for us to get the country that we actually want. And so the question is, are we so focused on the limited space of one election where we're just looking at that saying, okay, well, hopefully we get somebody who can correct these wrongs? and hopefully we can stop Trump. Because what I'm telling you, when you see Trump and you see Project 2025, what you should see is how the same man who was Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, Lee Atwater, his Southern strategy was put into place over 20 years. 20 years it took for Project 2025 to come about. And no, just an election of one Democrat at the top spot is not going to change that overnight. It's going to take long-term investment. And I think the unfortunate side is, and I'll end on this, the unfortunate side that I see, especially how Democrats and Republicans campaign, that Democrats are really good players and Republicans, unfortunately, are really good winners. And if it takes President Biden to have to add an extra seat to the Supreme Court, he wasn't willing to do it. Should have done it, didn't do it. It's going to take far more. And you know what? If it takes several cycles for us to finally get in authentic people who are going to do more than just satisfy the one group that they feel is the base, but actually satisfy all of those Democrats, all of those who are working class, the 99% of Americans who want their country to work for them and don't want to have convicted felons representing them, but at the same time, don't want to have people who are ready to bomb innocent people and tell them one thing, but allow for their money and actions to show something different. People are demanding difference. And if it takes several election cycles for them to get what they want, I think people are willing to give it.
Representative Holly, before we conclude tonight, I do want to get your take on the Save America Act, because this law, if enacted, going back to what you had just mentioned about African-American voters being the base of the Democratic Party, they are very much aware of that, which is why this law is even being considered right now in the Congress. And it's noteworthy that Donald Trump has placed his political weight not behind border security, which he made his political altar. Remember, border security was the reason why so many Latinos themselves said that they were voting for Donald Trump. Well, he put his weight fully behind the Save America Act. In fact, he said he doesn't want to sign any law unless this is passed. He's hell-bent. He's serious. He's playing for keeps when it comes down to taking away Black voting rights. And so if enacted,
voting rights,
if enacted, it will require proof of citizenship for voter registration in federal elections and add new voter ID rules with immediate effect, according to reporting on the bill. And I say Black voters because, let's face it, when he's looking at the aftermath of the 2020 election, even now, while he's sitting in the White House, 6 years removed from that election, the areas that he's looking are not white areas. He's not looking at, predominantly white. He's looking at areas in Metro Atlanta. He's looking at areas like Detroit. He's looking at cities that have a high Black concentration population. And so critics, including myself, have said that this is, in a sense, a poll tax, because obtaining documents like a birth certificate would require at least $15 to $30 if you don't have one. And then if you need a passport, that's over $130. And that time, and so in a sense, you could pay over $200 just to exercise your constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. And this, in a sense, puts a barrier for many who feel apathetic about the process altogether. Many who feel like, you know what, I came out to vote in 2024. In 2020, I'm tired. I'm just going to sit down because whoever's going to win is going to win, and I'm not going to get anything changed in my life. Well, that kind of voter is what they're counting on with this piece of legislation. What would this mean on the ground in the state of Georgia?
I mean, well, it's a horrible reality, and I mean, you look across the country. I think it said roughly you got 140 million people who don't have access to a passport. I think 69 million are without. Look at women who married. I think it's roughly. I think the number is about 69 million who don't have a who don't have their last name, their maiden name is not on the documents that they use now in terms of their driver's license, and so they have to go back. So it doesn't affect just African Americans. I think when you look at the cities that he's targeting, you got, these are cities that are largely Democrat influenced. Because honestly, if Trump had a bunch of who's that dude? You got a bunch of Tim Scotts. If there were a whole bunch of folks who are Black Republican who were going to vote for Trump, the same people who wear the Blacks for Trump's T-shirts at the rallies, Trump would be just fine with if they were able to vote him in. Now, granted, I don't think he respects their intelligence much, but he's okay with people. We already know that he is classist. We already know that he's only looking out for those who are able to spend at the level that he's able to spend. We already know that he's had the White House for sale to tech billionaires, which is how we got Doge, which is how we got Palantir. We got JD Vance in there. We already see that he has sold the democracy to the highest bidder and brought them into his administration. And I think that his focus is about keeping power. And he knows that, whether, is he a racist? Yeah, it's obvious, right? But what is he really looking for? Is he looking to be liked by Black people? Nah, he's looking for a win. And he's looking for a win in states where Democratic parties have a very strong majority. So, he's coming to Georgia. He's coming to Georgia. Here we have, as I'm a member of a legislative Black caucus that is the largest Black caucus in the country. If not the largest, we're the second largest, but we're in there. And he knows that the vast majority of us are Democrat. In fact, all of us are Democrat. And he knows that if he comes in here and he's able to send his troops in and be able to confiscate our ballot boxes, if he's able to set up troops to intimidate people, rewind our times back to the, late 1950s, basically having, this kind of Bull Connor position, he knows that he's going to intimidate people from coming out to vote. Now, will it largely be, Black folks? Yeah, but it's not just us, right? Look at the huge funding to the Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE. That when you're going to have these officers out there, that intimidation aspect is not just for those who are born a descendant of enslaved Africans. That's also for your folks from the Caribbean, folks from Latin American, folks who are themselves who are working class folks who are maybe in the process of getting their immigration status resolved through the courts, of those who are here under temporary protected status who are not yet voters. The whole purpose of the SAVE Act is to front this lie that non-citizens are voting. And the truth is that most people who are immigrants to this country know that there's far more to lose by trying to pass themselves off as voters, which is why our election systems are actually some of the fairest in the world. We have multiple agencies actually looking at our election systems and have done so, again, which is why you can't find a Heritage Foundation study before Donald Trump took office that says that U.S. has mass voter fraud. You can't find it because it doesn't exist. And so I think for us, we have to realize that, yes, the SAVE Act is horrible. I think it's highly unconstitutional. I do think that, if it does pass, it will certainly it will see it as a case being heard by the Supreme Court, which has been, stacked by President Trump during his first administration. Again, Biden, we would really love to have extra people in the Supreme Court, but you chose not to get that. So, fingers crossed, right? Not a great position to be in. But, it's what it is. And I think that, fortunately, because of a lot of the hard times, maybe Americans will be able to get it. Hopefully by the time November comes around and we're able to flip some seats and get the House back, but I think ultimately, it's a sad state of affairs where we are. But again, like I said before, the Southern strategy that led to Project 2025 took over 25 years of serious investment, 30 years of serious investment. Unless we invest in our ideas that run counter to that, unless we make sure that our ideals that are specified in the Democratic Party platform uh, become mandates on the institutions that make it certain that working class people can get ahead, that the same joys that African Americans have can be the joys that our brothers and sisters have who work alongside us, who live in our communities. When you look around Black communities, even in Georgia, and you say, wait a second, what's this white man doing in my block? What's this Latino man doing on my block? What's this Caribbean man doing on my block? Oh, I get it. They're in my community. They're my neighbor. I think the biggest problem of Black history is that our history remains only told inside our community. When people realize that the freedom fighters of the African American destiny have stories, even for them, have lessons for them, what you're going to realize is how will America look when Latinos take on the responsibility of Harriet Tubman, when they take on the responsibility of Frederick Douglass, when they realize that the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, have been with us for many years, and that it took organizations working alongside our communities to make this country better. What you're going to realize is that the real change that's actually going to serve people may last beyond one simple election cycle, the same way that Project 2025 was not an overnight thing. It happened with years and years of building capacity. And hopefully you might see that the work on the ground to organize in Congressional District 14 wasn't for the race of taking Marjorie Taylor Greene out. No. How about it's for when this state eventually turns purple and flips? That's what it's about. So sometimes we have to actually have the patience to look at the grand scheme, and that it can't just be looking at who's going to take this spot in the next election. Nah, sometimes you got to invest wholly in this because you see generational change that will pass down from your generation into the next one.
Thank you. And that's exactly why I always encourage my viewers, I encourage people, personal conversations to, to understand and know their history. If there seems to be a largely predominantly Black overtone in this conversation, it's because, let's face it, one disadvantaged, marginalized group in this country hasn't received reparations. Jewish Americans received it. Japanese Americans received it. Native Americans have received it. African Americans have not. That's controversial. and just to build on what you were saying, the opposition party, whether we like it or not, whether we like the fact that there's a binary system or not, that's what we have. And on day 2 of Donald Trump's return to office, he signed an executive order to do away with a civil rights era policy, executive policy that banned discrimination in the federal workplace. That wasn't by happenstance.
Not at all.
The document didn't just stumble upon his desk. It was carefully chosen very early in his administration to get that done. They have been taking a hatchet to the 14th Amendment in the Supreme Court. Why? Because they understand that that is the gateway to be able to determine who qualifies for citizenship, who qualifies to be targeted as an other legally. They're going after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're going after the Voting Rights Act. They already took out Section 5 in Shelby versus Holder. They're going after Section 2. They're trying to water down this bill as much as they can, because the greatest attempt that American democracy has made at becoming a true representation of what it says it is on paper happened in the Reconstruction era. And that's why they're taking a hatchet to Reconstruction era policies and Civil Rights era policies. Meanwhile, African Americans are listening to folks like Nick Cannon driving around in a car with what's her name, talking about the Democratic Party was the party of the KKK and Republicans freed the slaves. Obviously, they've slept through a whole segment multiple history classes, because the story doesn't end there.
Right.
In 1964, when the Republican Party nominated a man who literally took a public stance against the Civil Rights Act of 64, wrote a book called The Conscience of a Conservative. His name is Barry Goldwater.
Barry Goldwater.
They nominated him. Jackie Robinson, who was a Republican, compared the atmosphere of Cow Palace, which is where the Republican convention was being held, to that of Nazi Germany, because they chased out the African-American delegates.
Yep.
And that's before we even get to Nixon's Southern strategy of 68. This is 64. And you know, there are so
that's
many.
Also the problem of us listening to celebrities who don't know a dang thing about, like, you know, this field. Like, let them entertain us. Let them, you know, let Nick Cannon, you know, let him be a moderator of game shows, right? Don't listen to that guy for, you know, intelligence on political thought. It's just not his specialty.
Exactly. And so, you know, so often we're looking for the candidate that makes us feel good, the candidate that, you know, makes us feel inspired. Folks, we need to be inspired by our own interests. And again, you know, we need to look, you know, I'm not trying to be a shill for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a vehicle. That's all it is. It's a vehicle. It's a vehicle to ensure that we get closer to a true democracy, a vehicle to make sure that we have our rights fully intact. And the other side, up to this point, has nothing to offer. If they had anything to offer, I would highlight it. I would champion it. I would celebrate it. They have nothing to offer. And so, you know, when folks want to pick and choose, oh, well, you know, what has Kamala Harris done? Where's Joe Biden? That's why I get critical, because, you know, have we been paying attention to what we have seen? And listen, I'm not saying don't hold them accountable. That's another thing, because people think holding folks accountable means not voting. That's not holding people accountable. That's shooting yourself in the foot and calling it progress. Holding people accountable means I will give you the vote, but once you're in there, I'm going to do everything it takes to push you closer to where I am. Martin Luther King endorsed a candidate in 1964, and it was Lyndon Johnson, and he spent the rest of the 1960s in an antagonistic relationship with that man that he endorsed publicly. And so we have to be wise and discerning about how we approach politics, because we approach it like it's pop the balloon or find love.
That's a good analogy, but that's a good analogy. I disagree a little bit. I disagree with that. Again, I think it's a cumulative effect, and it's not about. I hear all you're saying is lesser of two evils, but I think that you never get good if you're always going to back the lesser of the two evil.
But this is what I'm saying. I'm operating in not the world I want to be in, but the world we currently have. And this is the African Americans have always been at getting the bad end of the stick. You know, both parties have not fully represented the interest of African Americans all throughout American history. So what I'm saying is, we have to look at ourselves and look at our predicament in the mirror, look at it for what it is and not what we wish it could be, and make a wise choice, and then put all of our political capital, once we do win, towards, you know, holding accountable through you know, pressure campaigns, through boycotting, through, you know, protesting, through town hall meetings, through midterm elections, to do everything we can to channel that person, to push that person that we put in office closer to our position.
But did you notice, Michael, when saying that, again, you're speaking to what was done all through 23 and 24. But the thing is, it wasn't just our 13% in the U.S. It was done by a lot more than our 13%. And if the administration chose not to listen and chose to disregard and say, hey, we got our base and we're good, well, then they should be overjoyed with our current results. Because again, like you said, put the pressure, protest, do all that. And it's supposed to get what you want. But when people did it and it didn't get them what they want, they were expecting for the administration to respond. And when the administration ignored them, this is what we got today. So it's like, here's the old saying. There's no permanent friends, there's no permanent enemies, it's just permanent interests. And when you disregard those interests and think you got it, the public will tell you that you may be an emperor without any clothes.
Well, Representative Holly, this has been an amazing discussion. I want to thank you for joining me tonight for a timely and insightful conversation about where Georgia politics stands and where it may be headed next. What happens in the state never stays in the state. It helps
never.
American.
Don't get me talking about the gubernatorial race. Whew, nuts.
Next time you come on, we definitely got to talk about it. So, Representative Holly, thank you for what you brought to the table, and please continue the good fight at the Georgia State Legislature. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for making time. With that being said, that's going to conclude tonight's episode of the Political Mike Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike Podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.